Welcome to the SMBAdvertising podcast, where our aim is to help 1 million small and medium-sized businesses to succeed with their advertising. My name is Mike Damjanovic, and I'm the host of this really special podcast, which is aiming to deliver value to our listeners and those of you that are watching. So today, I'm really excited. We have a very special guest in the studio. Her name is Christina. She's from Google. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you here. So today, Christina, you're going to be talking to us about and sharing your knowledge about why and how and what companies should be doing in terms of experimentation. You're originally from Germany, but you've been living in Norway for over a decade now.
Yes, that's correct.
And you've had quite a journey in terms of the companies that you're working with. I believe you've been working for DNB for a time, and now lately at Google. I think perhaps to start with, we could talk about your PhD, which you have, which has to do with experimentation. Would you like to start by just saying a little bit about that?
Yes, sure thing. Well, I came to Norway in order to take a PhD in economics at the Norwegian School of Economics. And the PhD had a focus on behavioral and experimental economics. So we also worked with large data sets, but primarily, two-thirds of my PhD focused on behavioral and experimental economics. And as part of that, we had a collaboration with the tax administration. And the tax administration has received data on taxpayers that received income abroad. And with that, they were able to see if there were any discrepancies on the Norwegian tax returns. And with that, we were able to identify 18,000 people who actually did have quite large discrepancies. And the tax administration naturally asked themselves, how can we most effectively communicate with those taxpayers in order to increase voluntary compliance? So a little bit like you have a big question in marketing today, in terms of personalization, how do you most effectively communicate with your customers? Who knows the answer to this? Nobody really. You need to figure it out. And how do you figure it out? Well, experimentation definitely is a great tool in your toolbox in that case. So what we essentially did was that we divided the sample that we were given by the tax administration into different groups. We sent them different letters and varied the communication in those letters, and measured how much they actually declared on the next tax return. And with that, only by sending those letters. So we didn't have anything more resource intensive to do than just sending out that letter, or like drafting the letter and sending it out. We actually were able to collect 122 million Norwegian kroners at that point. So it was quite effective, right? There's still a way to go, but yeah.
So sort of essentially in that respect, by experimentation with the messaging,
yes,
you were able to find out which one worked the best, and as an end result, you were able to collect 122 million Norwegian crowns.
Yes.
And I think that's incredibly relevant. The podcast is obviously not about tax evasion, but about experimentation. And we heard in a previous episode about exactly that. When you are pushing out your ads or your website, what is the type of messaging that you have there? Is it something that I personally just think is relevant to my potential customers, or is it actually am I experimenting and finding the messaging that is relevant? So that's really pertinent. Anything more to add there?
Yeah, I think you put it quite nicely. And I think what's very important here is as well that we were 3 professors and me, the PhD student, on that project, and we all had different ideas of which message was going to be the most effective, right? And if I've learned one thing throughout this experiment, but also through further experiments that we did, is that, you have to replace intuition with you could test your intuition, right? So you have to dare to be wrong. Yeah. At times as well, and own that as well. It's not bad to be wrong, but try to test your intuition, because if your intuition is wrong, then you do something very ineffectively in order to reach your customers, right? So You have to own to be wrong, dare to be wrong at times, and test that intuition of yours.
And what happens when we're wrong? We learn.
Yes.
And we improve.
Precisely.
Perfect.
And one thing that I also learned is that what was true yesterday might not be true today, right? So this is a constant learning journey. This type of personalization of the message, it's constantly evolving. We have a constantly evolving world and we need to adapt. So if you have a best practice that was true yesterday, there might be a best practice that is true tomorrow, right?
Is that true also in the opposite? If, for example, you've tried something, let's say a year ago, and it didn't work, that could be that you try it this year and it could work much better.
Oh, most definitely.
Great. So let's start with the what. So what is your definition of experimentation?
Okay. So I would describe experimentation as a data-driven way to test different alternatives. So the data-drivenness here, with a little bit of rigor and a little bit of technicalities, I think can replace decision-making based on intuitions. Experimentation can also help to complement existing data science models. So it could be, for instance, that companies are testing out media mix models, right? But there's a lot of statistical issues with media mix models, and one way to go about this could be, for instance, also to calibrate these media mix models with experimentation estimates. So that would be one way to go about this. So at the same time, certain companies would need to really ramp up their data science teams in order to do this. But sometimes companies don't have the means to have full-blown data science teams, right? Maybe not even the entire data at their disposal. So in that case, experimentation can also help them to do data-driven decisions in a smaller context.
Yeah, okay. So with that in mind then, my second question to you goes towards the what. So here we have, what should companies be experimenting with?
All right, there's a lot that they can do. If we're staying in the marketing area, you could test your ad creatives, right? So if you want to reach a certain target group, what sort of creative are they most responding to? Or when it comes to customer acquisition, which media channel should you use, right? Which media channel is most effective in driving exactly that type of traffic that you're interested in and that type of audience that you're interested in? Alternatively, you could also look at your customer journey, right? The moment that people are coming onto your website or into your app, how do you optimize the way until the conversion that you want your customers to take, be it to fill out a form, sign up for a newsletter, or in the end also do a sale?
Yeah, absolutely. Some minor tweaks can actually provide a lot of results.
Absolutely.
Especially with the customer journey, as you said. And I like what you said about the different creatives, testing different creatives. Perhaps a video, a short-term video, could actually be much more easily digestible for your target audience. At the same time, it could also be images, different channels, whether it's Google or Facebook, if I'm allowed to say those two in the same sentence with you. Okay, but then I think we've kind of also touched on the next question, but like why and what types of companies should be experimenting?
Any company should be experimenting. Very important in that case is also to create this culture of experimentation, right? Again, I can only repeat myself so many times, but to dare to be wrong, maybe even celebrate failure reports, right? So that people also dare to share their failures, because even the failures, if we should call them such, they also generate knowledge. So in that sense, to share, disseminate that type of knowledge, not to reinvent the wheel all the time, because that is very resource intensive and it actually slows down the progress, the innovation, it slows down the knowledge building across the organization.
Yeah, and you talked about a little bit earlier about data science teams. The majority of our listeners obviously probably are not at that stage yet. But is it your opinion that irrelevant or irrespective of how large a company is, they should be experimenting with different things.
I believe so, yes, because even if you're thinking about the scaling, you should anchor wanting to find data-driven, or like wanting to do data-driven decisions. You should anchor that already very early on. If you don't have data science teams yet, then how can you base your decisions on data? Well, experimentation is definitely a possibility. Yeah. So
I guess, I think we've heard this before, but if I have an opinion about something, if I can't back it up with data, then it's still just an opinion.
Yes, precisely.
But if I can back it up with data, then it becomes a fact.
Very nicely put, yeah.
Great. So last question, and I think we have 4 points here about how a company should actually be experimenting. Should we take it from the top?
Yes, let's do that. So you absolutely have to know what you want to know. It sounds so simple, it sounds so trivial, but ultimately sometimes you want to know too much and you can't narrow it down in order to actually make it a test with we call it a testable hypothesis, right? The moment that you have a hypothesis, you actually, it's a thought process in a way. You narrow down the idea of what you want to test into one simple sentence. And when you have if you run experiments, you essentially do statistical testing. So then you need a hypothesis that you want to test and the alternate hypothesis, right? And they should be mutually exclusive. And a lot of times I've seen that they actually overlap. And then it's not really clear what you want to test. So it's very important that you actually narrow down what you want to know and try and actually write it out, and then have the alternative hypothesis, what you're testing against.
So you would actually write it down, know what it is that you want to test.
Most definitely, that's super important. Yeah.
And then your second thing?
That you should develop a testing framework. You have to define the R&Rs. So roles and responsibilities, who is in charge of running this, who's in charge of analyzing the results, but also, you have a lot of things that you want to test and you need to prioritize those tests. Ideally, you want to test everything, right? But it's resource intensive and there's also an opportunity cost to testing. So then opportunity cost is an economist's term, but essentially at heart I'm an economist, right? So apologies for the terminology here. But opportunity cost is basically the cost that the alternative to the experiment would have been. So for instance, just implementing and seeing how it goes. Because sometimes we don't need to have the gold standard measurement to do things. And sometimes we get carried away wanting to experiment all too much as well. So a testing framework would help you to rank hypotheses based on importance and to also maintain a backlog on what you want to test next. What you want to test next.
Structuring things up.
Precisely.
And then your third point, which I think is something that is probably one of the most important things, act upon the results.
Yes, I have seen this all too often, that we got results and then decision makers wouldn't act upon it. And that goes throughout my PhD, because we did pro bono consulting during the PhD as well. But that goes a little bit hand in hand with knowing what you want to test and having a testing framework. How important is this test to me? Will I act upon the results, right? If you don't act upon the results, then you're again using resources for nothing. And here again, that might go a little bit hand in hand with my last point, that we have to create a culture of experimentation in every single company in order to succeed with data-driven decision-making, because otherwise people will never dare to be wrong or dare to be tested. So not acting upon the results could also be a result of maybe not believing the results, or believing that the intuition is still correct even though the data says something else.
I think this is so relevant. We talk often about having this growth mindset, which essentially is don't worry about getting things wrong, because when we get something wrong and we learn from something, and then we become more knowledgeable, and we can go further.
Precisely.
And then the last point here, create a culture of around experimentation.
Yes, I've also mentioned it a little bit before, but celebrate the so-called failures, right? Dare to be wrong, own the fact that you have been wrong, and test your intuitions. because this is something where I believe over time people become so valuable, because based on their experience of what has worked in the past, what has not worked in the past, they build up a knowledge base that is very difficult also to document. And with that, they become invaluable. This type of experience is really invaluable. It's so important to actually go through these stages and understand how our customers actually react to the different types of messages.
Yeah. So, Christine, I have one more question that's not scripted, and that is, if there is just one thing from what we've spoken about today, one thing that our listeners could take away, what would that be?
That's very clear. You should most definitely test your intuition more often, and you should dare to be wrong more often.
There we have it. So now we've gone through experimentation together, and we've talked about the why, the how, and the what. And I think together with what you've said now about dare to test your intuitions, dare to experiment, dare to be wrong, I would also add the last point that you spoke about, which is know what you want to know, develop a testing framework, act upon the results. I also would like to underline that one. And then create a culture around experimentation, which obviously ties in with what you said now. Dare to be wrong, dare to test things out. So thank you so much for coming in, Christina.
Thanks again so much for having me.
Perfect. So thanks so much, guys, for listening. We really appreciate you listening and following along on the SMBAdvertising podcast. This is actually episode 13, done and dusted. So we'll see you next time.